to Jenny Mander's presentation, who is joining us online from Cambridge, and we'll be discussing transatlantic performances of colonial ways of loving, Framéry's La Colonie, and the anonymous Lettres de Madame P.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. We're running a little late, so I shall jump straight in, but thanks to everyone for the invitation. I want to begin with the opening words of the Abbé Raynal's Histoire des deux Indes, first published in 1770. I begin here because I think these words capture the conditions of modernity or modernities that are the focus of this conference and its framework for our exploration of the circulation of ideas, networks, and agencies, informing the dynamics of gender. Modernity here is understood by Raynal, or perhaps Diderot contributed anonymously to the text, in terms of global exchange. And global exchange, in turn, driven by commerce, is presented as resulting in a continuous process of change. And moreover, on account of the multiple intermediaries engaged in global commerce, the changing landscape of modernity is portrayed as inherently unpredictable. So exchange involves continuous change, and continuous change defines modernity in terms of inherent unpredictability. I want to consider how this unpredictability of modernity extends to the texts that circulate as material objects across land and sea during this period, and of course to the ideas that they carry with them. So against Bruno Latour's conception of European print objects as immutable mobiles, my interest, like so many others at this conference, is on the instability of the network of associations that gather around the texts as they move, and the implications that this instability might have for our interpretation of Enlightenment gender debates. So underpinning my argument is the notion that the constant recycling of plots and tropes creates the sort of familiarity or conventionality that allows gender debates of the global Enlightenment to be adapted to local contexts, adjusted to topical interests, and indeed on occasion repurposed in perhaps wholesale ways by writers and readers, performers and audiences. Now, for reasons of time, I won't discuss Framéry's reworking of Sacchini's L'Isola d'Amore as La Colonie. Suffice it to say that this is a musical parody that's focusing on marriage. It's marriage that brings social order to the colonial island that has been populated through shipwreck. That's for another time. Today, I'm going to restrict myself to some more speculative remarks in relation to a colonial reworking of Laclos' Les Liaisons Dangereuses, a rewriting that appeared in the same year of 1782 under the title of the Lettres de Madame P. Here you can see Laclos pictured here with his close friend, the virtuoso violinist, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who had been born on the French colony of Guadeloupe. Now, in the exaggerated colonial pastiche, as in the original, the restriction of marital exclusivity are belligerently flouted by a Creole Merteuil in search of multiple and diverse pleasures. As all will be familiar with the conventionalized feminization of the American landscape within colonial discourse, and more specifically with the colonial representation of the Caribbean and other islands as female bodies that are exploitable and penetrable, wild spaces to be dominated and possessed. And the region has arguably yet to extricate itself fully from this image that's perpetuated by tourism marketing with the ubiquitous girl in the bikini trope. My contention is that the Lettres de Madame P reappropriate playfully yet politically this figure of the hospitable libertine associated with the topography of the colonial island. I want to suggest that the Lettres, through their parody, recharge, even revolutionize the significance of this familiar colonial discourse through ironic reference to debates that relate above all to the regulation of colonial trade. My suggestion here is that the sexual politics serve as an opportune canvas for foreign policy debates around l'exclusif, the protectionist system through which the French crown sought to restrict all trade to and from her colonial possessions. Restrictions to French shipping and French merchants, excluding direct commercial intercourse with foreigners. An exclusivity that was a source of increasing tension between the colonial administration and Versailles, between planters, free people of color, and the enslaved black population, and between French and other colonial powers. So through this one intriguing example, I want to hint at how familiar tenets of an 18th century Enlightenment moral and anthropological discourse on women are mobilized for the purpose of foreign rather than domestic relations. And I want to ask the question whether in the process of this mobilization, these tropes are set free from their conventional moorings. The text, of which there's just one known example, could perhaps be better described as a pamphlet, for it barely comprises 30 pages. The story is related through 10 letters. They're written very much on the move by the eponymous Madame P, who, as indicated on the title page, was born on the island of Saint-Domingue. Her correspondent, a certain Monsieur L, is likewise introduced as a French settler or habitant of Cap Français, the large, wealthy and cosmopolitan city on the northern coast of the French part of the island, and which had become an important cultural and commercial center, in part because of its geographical accessibility to transatlantic traffic. But not unlike the ironic play between the two contradictory prefaces at the beginning of Laclau's novel, the title page here, hiding beneath a double level of anonymity, draws the reader into a game of hide and seek. The author not only hides behind the anonymity of the correspondence, but perhaps more teasingly, the place of publication, which, like the two correspondents, is said to have been La Cap or Cap Français. Now, must we necessarily assume that this is a false imprint? We might have some pause for thought given the brevity of the document and also the existence of newspapers and plays that were printed on local presses, plays that included, by way of example, a new work performed by the Comédie du Cap that was drawn from Reyna's Histoire, and a Creole parody of Rousseau's Devin du Village. But my point is whether or not the pamphlet was printed on the island or in Europe, or indeed elsewhere, for example, North America, the title page makes its colonial dimension unavoidably central to its significance, and the significance of colonial relations to the well-being of the mother country. Now, it's at the end of Laclau's novel that Merte is forced into exile. But in the case of these letters, exile marks the beginning of Madame P's transatlantic journey, her first letter being written on board ship as she is forced to leave the island. And in keeping with the nature of parody, the conventions of the libertine novel are exposed. And in this case, the reproductive consequences of female libertinage are given unusual centrality and not conveniently suppressed, unlike, for example, when Cécile miscarries, the fruit of her liaison with Valmont. And in Madame P's second letter, sent from Cadiz, the Creole Merte speaks cheerfully and openly of her advanced state of pregnancy, and predictably of her uncertainty as to the father. It can't, of course, be her husband, but it might be either Monsieur L or indeed his rival, a certain DS, a DM. In the third letter sent from the port of Brest, the political dimensions of the novelistic pamphlet become more conspicuous, I'd suggest. Madame P writes that she's had to give birth on board ship, and the father is in fact her black companion. The infant is evidently of mixed race, but with light-colored skin similar to her own. And you can note that she breaks the news with a parody of Enlightenment philosophy to Monsieur L. And in the postscript to this same letter, Madame P expresses her outrage at the deportation of her black companion, an allusion, no doubt, to the Déclaration of 1777 that sought, against mounting anxiety regarding racial mixing, to prohibit the entry of all non-whites into France. It is quite clear from the text that notwithstanding the new law and the deportation of the father, the baby boy born on board is now alive and well on French soil and has been placed in the excellent care of a wet nurse just outside the port town, referencing, of course, another staple of Enlightenment gender criticism. At this point, Madame P sets off alone, vowing, just like Merte, to avenge herself. But now she vows to avenge herself qua Creole, against not just the male sex, but against the French nation. And whereas at the end of Les Liaisons, Merte is forced to leave Paris, and her fate is overdetermined by her loss of an eye through smallpox and the loss of a long-running lawsuit, leaving her bankrupt. In the case of our Creole Merte, she is now heading for Paris, infected not with smallpox, but with the great pox, that is syphilis, which she of course spreads across the male population indiscriminately. First a doctor, then an officer in the merchant navy, another in the artillery, a member of the aristocracy of high standing in the law courts, and then the captain of the ship which had brought her from Saint-Domingue. Not only does Madame P spread disease, but with ironic reference to Merte, she also wreaks widespread financial havoc, bleeding her lovers for money, refusing to pay bills, willing to perjure herself and calumny others. Her goal is explicitly to profit at the expense of Europeans, and that is a refrain across the remaining letters. And it's ultimately the captain of the transatlantic ship who gets the better of her, spreading widely her story, such that, again, like Merte, she's run out of Paris and takes refuge for a short while in Boulogne. Yet unlike Merte, her final letter expresses her determination to return to combat in the French capital. The 10 letters recycle very familiar positions of the gender debates, notably the double standards of men who blame women for giving them what they want and who preach fidelity without practicing it. The Creole Merte preaches a philosophy of pleasure, but what precisely is the fight, we might ask, to which she wishes to return in the French capital? And I hope an understanding of the colonial context might suggest further associations when Madame P declares that she will never be subjected to a law that restricts pleasure to one lover, a ridiculous law, she says, impossible to follow. The island colony of Saint-Domingue certainly had a long-standing reputation for libertine mores dating back to the reports of the 17th century missionaries. And this was still circulating at the end of the 18th century in the writing of European visitors, such as the Baron de Wimpfen. Read from a metropolitan perspective, then, the pamphlet might seem to simply exploit these entrenched views of the libertine island. But criticism of island libertine mores was, however, not only a feature of European discourse. There were those within the local white elite who saw the increasing mixed race population as a threat to their power and sought actively to outlaw interracial liaisons. And one such, il y a Dubertet, a colonial administrator on the island, whose considérations were very widely read in Europe and on Saint-Domingue itself. Dubertet condemns the unregulated sexuality on the island, male and female, Creole and European, and he attributes the excessive craving of Creole women for physical pleasure and their illicit commerce with the Black population to boredom and lack of meaningful activity in plantation society. So Madame P seems to match this profile. A Creole perspective then on the pamphlet is equally plausible. But a Creole perspective encourages the text to be read beyond sexual politics and domestic order. To return to Dubertet, although the publication of his Considérations was supported by the Ministère de la Marine, he was far from being a spokesperson for Versailles or for French merchants. He was a staunch advocate for colonial independence. And I'd suggest from this perspective, Madame P's hostility to Europeans assumes particular potency. My main point here is that without further evidence of authorship, this curious pamphlet is cut loose from the moorings that might fix its meaning or define its purpose. The gender politics in this context are more than ambiguous and take on different associations depending on which side of the Atlantic it might be read, or which side or to which audience it was intended. But what is not ambiguous in the letters is that official efforts to regulate colonial relations were failing, both on the island and on French soil. Recall that the offspring of the illicit commerce of Madame P with her Black companion was flourishing on French soil, notwithstanding the deportation of the father. So the letters might be read as a jocular yet pointed warning against the corruption of colonial licentiousness, but perhaps don't seem to advocate for tighter regulation. The example of the protagonist is that regulation will never succeed. And in this context, with all the financial references, the libertine seems to emerge ever more clearly as an emblem of colonial trading relations. So over the 18th century, it became abundantly clear to those involved that there was a fundamental contradiction between the theory of a trading system confined to one nation and the existence of an international demand which could offer more interesting conditions to planters and merchants in the colony. And indeed, colonial planters and merchants had long enjoyed intensive trading connections, mostly illicit, with others in the West Indies, continental North America, and on the Spanish Main. And Cap Français, the place or the ostensible place of publication of these letters, was the primary port for this foreign trade. Even following the mitigation of the exclusive system of trade after the 7 Years' War, it was the case that the regulations served neither the colony nor the mother country, since the illicit trade contributed to the ever-increasing colonial debts, as colonists gave priority to payments to the foreign suppliers of goods bought outside the legal framework, letting the French merchants wait. All of which pointed to the futility and fallacy of keeping the colonies within a closed framework of relations with the mother country. So in this context, I hope to have suggested by these very fragmentary remarks, at least that the specificities of context, suggest many new associations that may have been mobilized by this curious creolization of Laclau's Les Liaisons Dangereuses, and the very strong sense that through parody, conventional discourse on gender and sexual politics, including that relating to the libertine island, might become subordinated to debates regarding foreign policy. So the question that this then leaves us with, which can't be answered here, and perhaps which can't be answered except in very granular ways, is what is the effect on female agency when a libertine woman, such as Madame P, is represented in such an exaggerated and cynical fashion as the mouthpiece for commercial and political freedoms? Does parody reinforce or unravel the supposedly stable networks of associations relating to Enlightenment discourse on gender? Perhaps simply the thought experiment as to whether the letters were sent one side or another of the Atlantic is itself instructive, as it encourages attention to offstage voices. Thank you very much.